In this video, I will be fully refurbishing a GameCube controller. You will need some supplies. You will need a tri-wing screwdriver and a Phillips head screwdriver, as well as some Q-tips, isopropyl alcohol, 409 cleaner, a can of duster, and a toothbrush. Depending on your controller's condition, you may also want to replace the analog caps for both the C-stick and the control stick. As you can see, the analog cap on this controller's control stick has been entirely worn off, so I will be replacing that. I will provide links in the description for the necessary screwdrivers as well as replacement analog caps. Begin by removing the 6 tri-wing screws located on the back of the GameCube controller. With the buttons of the controller facing down, carefully remove the back half of the controller's shell. Next, we will be lifting the circuit board away from the front half of the controller's shell. Start by lifting the controller's cord away from the chassis. Next, grip the base which holds the rumble motor and lift the circuit board away from the shell. Now remove all of the conductive rubber pads as well as the buttons from the shell of the controller. I like to place these in a small cup to keep them in a safe spot. Now add some 409 to the cup of rubber conductive pads and buttons in order to clean and sanitize them. Next, remove the triggers from the back half of the shell. You can swap shells if you would like. Use the appropriate Phillips head screwdriver to remove 2 small black screws from each trigger's housing. Now remove the 2 black plastic guards that sit atop the triggers. Now remove the trigger assembly by compressing the whole thing and carefully removing it away from the shell. Now disassemble the trigger assembly. Each trigger assembly is comprised of 5 parts: the trigger button itself, a spring, a metal clip, the trigger base, and a rubber conductive pad. Certain parts of the trigger assembly are designed specifically for either the right or the left trigger, so please make note of which parts belong with each trigger. Now, we will remove the analog caps for both the control stick and the C-stick. If you have decided to replace these, you can discard them. Otherwise, set them aside for cleaning. Place your fingers underneath each analog cap and pull up gently. We will now clean the controller's circuit board with isopropyl alcohol and Q-tips. Using 91% or higher isopropyl alcohol is preferred. However, I'm just using 70% because that's what I had laying around. Make sure to change your Q-tips periodically as they become dirty. Also focus on cleaning off the conductive circuitry where the buttons are pressed. If so desired, you can clean the entire circuit board using this method. On the back of the circuit board, be sure to clean the small conductive points as well as the sliders for the analog triggers. Also, clean the mechanical button for the Z button. It is important to gently clean the 3D analog joystick's internal components. Rotate the joystick around and use a Q-tip and isopropyl alcohol. Once you have finished swabbing, use a can of compressed air to remove the remaining dirt and isopropyl alcohol. Use the same process to clean the mechanical components of the C-stick. Set the circuit board aside in order to let the isopropyl alcohol evaporate fully. Now we will thoroughly clean the controller's shell. I recommend laying a dish towel down to absorb the 409 and the dirt. Spray the shell down with 409 and then scrub thoroughly with a toothbrush. After you finish scrubbing the shell, rinse off the shell under warm water and thoroughly remove all 409 residue. After a thorough rinse, dry the shell and also use compressed air to remove moisture from crevices. I feel that scrubbing the plastic components of the controller with 409 and then rinsing underwater does a phenomenal job at both cleaning and polishing the controller. Now clean the controller's buttons and rubber conductive pads using the same process. Once again, I cannot stress enough how important it is to make sure all of your components of the controller are entirely dry before reassembling. There are a couple components that require extra attention for drying, including the triggers and also the rubber conductive pads. Once all of your controller's components are completely dry, we can begin reassembling. Start by putting the buttons back into the front half of the controller's shell. All of the buttons only fit where they belong, so you should have no trouble in replacing them. Now, replace the rubber conductive pads back on top of the corresponding buttons. Be sure the gray side is facing down. There are holes where it lines up. Be sure the black dots are facing toward you. Now, we will reassemble the triggers. Begin by placing the rubber conductive pad into the base. Make sure that the black dot faces you. Next, we want to put the clip with the gap into the trigger base. Where the clip meets the base should always be facing outside of the controller. Now we will set the spring on top of the trigger base, and then set the corresponding trigger on top of the spring, and then insert the clip into the trigger. Now, compress the trigger assembly and insert the trigger assembly into the corresponding location on the controller's shell. Go ahead and set the corresponding trigger shield onto the trigger housing. Now, repeat the process for the next trigger. Once the trigger assemblies are reinstalled, go ahead and replace the small black screws, tightening them with a Phillips head screwdriver. Now we will install the analog caps for both the control stick and the C-stick. There is a small notch in both analog caps that lines up to the corresponding joystick. Simply line it up and firmly yet gently press down until it is fully seated. We will now insert the circuit board into the front half of the shell. Be sure that the rubber conductive pads are fully seated and all buttons are fully seated before inserting. Carefully line up the analog sticks and drop the circuit board into the shell. There are small holes on the chassis of the shell which will hold the circuit board in place. Next, we need to move the zip-tied portion of the controller's cord into the chassis. It fastens right around a small piece of plastic. Be sure to tuck the zip tie fully into the chassis. In order to properly reassemble the controller, the sliders for the analog triggers must be all the way in the upright position. We will now reinstall the Z button. There's a small notch in the chassis of the controller's shell, which will house a notch located on the Z button. With all components now in their place and properly installed, we will replace the back portion of the controller's shell. Make sure it clicks securely into the chassis. Do not force it, for there are small plastic notches where it must fit. Give your controller a quick button inspection, making sure everything feels good. Here, you can see why it was so important that we made sure the sliders for the triggers were in the upright position before reassembly. With both halves of the controller's shell properly mated, go ahead and replace the 6 screws, tightening them with the tri-wing screwdriver. Perform a final inspection, and then go enjoy your fully refurbished GameCube controller.